So the last segment I talked a bit about the Spanish-American War itself and the United States obtaining control over the Philippines, over Cuba, over Puerto Rico, and over Guam. It's worth considering that not everyone was thrilled with United States expansion. Indeed, there was considerable questioning of the war's moral sort of element, whether it was an immoral war, and the extent to which the rights that were assured to any U.S. citizen would be or should be extended to those individuals, those peoples now under U.S. control. Well, if we look at Cuba, you begin to get a sense that the United States is not ready to give up sort of oversight of these newly won territories, that the United States is indeed entering that imperial sphere. United States troops would remain in Cuba, not merely on the naval base that would become Guantanamo, of course, but in Cuba, maintaining order, and through 1902. And they would be involved, as would elements of the American government, in creating a new infrastructure for the island nation. This was an infrastructure that would be both physical in terms of roads and bridges, etc., but also political, as the United States assisted the Cubans develop their own government, their own independent government. But how very independent was the Cuban government? In 1901, the Platt Amendment, P-L-A-T-T, the Platt Amendment had been passed as a rider to a military appropriations bill in the United States Congress. The Platt Amendment ensured that Cuba would be unable to make an independent treaty with a foreign power, certainly without the consent of the United States. Moreover, the Platt Amendment ensured that the United States would have the ability to intervene in Cuba to preserve Cuban life and property and independence. Now, what this basically boils down to is that the United States reserves the right to control what happens in Cuba, even if the United States does not claim territorial control over Cuba thanks to the Teller Amendment. It's, as I suggested earlier, that you don't just have to control territory to be able to shape what's going on politically, culturally, in so many ways within territory that you've recently liberated, but now you control. One other element of the Platt Amendment is that land, Cuban land, would be reserved for a U.S. naval station, and that land will actually become Guantanamo Bay, a name that has become of great importance, certainly in the early 21st century, as the United States has dealt with issues of terrorism since 9/11. Investments in Cuba under this new regime jumped from $50 million in 1898 to some $220 million by 1914. In the Philippines, what happens is slightly different, but it too reminds us of the sort of processes of imperialism. From an early sort of joy at liberation from the Spanish, Filipinos rather quickly moved to discontent. They have been in the process of rebelling against Spanish rule. They're active. They fight in the Philippines on land, even as the American Navy is making inroads, of course, in Manila Bay. Filipino guerrillas are beginning to challenge and have been challenging Spanish rule. Admiral Dewey is hailed as a great liberator. But soon, the Filipinos realize something's a bit wrong here. And what's wrong is that the Americans don't seem to be packing up to leave. I've often imagined it, and I've told a lot of classes about this notion that ultimately, the Filipinos had to be thinking, well, okay, you've come, you've gone through this process of liberation. The assumption's been you're going to head out. When are you going? And the American response is, we'll go soon. A few months later, Filipino comes along and says, hey, notice you've been here a while. You said you were going to leave, but you don't look to be packing up. When are you thinking of going? American response, well, soon. Until finally, after asking that question numerous times, and there's no sign that American troops or American governance is in any way being removed from the island, it becomes clear that there's no real intention on the part of the United States to leave. Well, in January of 1899, and it didn't take that long, independent republic is established in the Philippines, led by Filipinos, and basically they restart that guerrilla war. A war that was fought against Spain as a sort of oppressor is now turned on the United States. It's led, the new government is led by Emilio Aguinaldo, and it will engage the United States in putting down an insurrection, because that's what it amounts to, putting down an insurrection from 1901 on and off through 1906. In other words, during that entire period, 1901 to 1906, the United States will be engaged in fighting in the jungles of the Philippines. The costs of the Spanish-American War to the United States are roughly $170 million, and thousands dead. But it's far more of a cost to the Filipinos, just as an example. Estimates vary. Historians will always vary on their estimates, it seems. But estimates are that while the United States may have lost as many as 5,000, the Filipinos, people, may have lost as many as 300,000 in the fighting that followed liberation. In the process of concluding their victory, in seeking to put down this insurrection, the United States was forced to turn to a strategy which placed Filipino civilians into restricted areas and camps, meant to pacify a violent insurrectionary population. It is, in fact, not so very different in policy terms from the ways that the Spanish had sought to deal with the Cuban population. Measures that ultimately had led the United States and the American public into war. In the next segment, what I'd like to do is turn our attention to a connection that I have seen, that I think exists, between what's happening with the United States abroad and what's happening domestically, between international and domestic affairs. And I think it's bound up with the underlying sort of ethics of imperialism, the policy decisions, the factors influencing policy, and bound up with some of what we've been talking about all along, specifically issues of race and citizenship and what it means to be a U.S. citizen, certainly in the 1890s.